I could use some good news. What about you? We spend a lot of time on this channel talking about what went wrong in nonprofit finance, about broken oversight systems, about fraud, embezzlement, bad actors. But how about what goes right? How about those leaders who stood down storms in the face of overwhelming odds and came out the other side? How about some good news? Specifically, we're here to talk about the 2025 federal funding crisis, a year that many nonprofit leaders feel was the hardest they've had to face in a very long time. Not all organizations survived, but for those who did, it took real leadership just to make it through. It wasn't without pain, and it wasn't without hard decisions, but they made it. And how they made it is worth a long look. Hey, welcome back to the Nonprofit CFO. On this channel, we talk through topics that are important to nonprofit finance managers, and we highlight them with real-life stories to see what we can learn together. So let's jump in. On January 20th, 2025, Yanti Saripto, the president and CEO of Save the Children U.S., was at a senior leadership executive retreat when the President of the United States wrote an executive order. The Trump administration had written an executive order freezing all foreign development aid immediately. For Save the Children, that funding amounted to almost a third of their entire global program budget. Saripto later described what happened in the room. Her team moved quickly through every stage of grief. Denial starting. Was it even possible for a sitting president to deny funding already approved by Congress? Moving through every stage until they finally reached acceptance. She wrote about it in the Harvard Business Review. She said, "We couldn't avoid or reverse this massive crisis, but we would stay calm, creative, and agile, and eventually navigate our way through it." And they did. Let's look at the specifics of Save the Children's response, because I think it's really illuminating. When the freeze hit in January, Saripto said their first priority was clarity. She said, "Our biggest priority in that initial month was trying to figure out what is the life-saving work that is terminated and that we have to continue so that no children die on our watch in the immediate term." That is very clarifying when you have that front and center, because everything else almost falls away. That is some stark phrasing and lays out the challenge in very clear terms. It's not denial, it's not panic, it's triage. What must continue? And what can we set aside if we absolutely have to, until we get through this moment? The second thing they did was over-communicate. Saripto used that exact word, over-communicate, with funders, with partners, with regulators. In a crisis, sometimes we want to hold on to our information until we have better information. But Save the Children went the other way. They let everybody else know that they didn't have the answers, but they knew what was going on right now and they were working to fix it. Because Saripto knew that in a crisis, silence gets filled with rumor. The third thing is that they had to change the way that they managed their cash flow. Saripto described it as managing cash the way that a scrappy business might. For an organization that had been used to government funding as a stable source for decades, this was a big change. It meant tightening cash flow monitoring procedures, and expense approvals now had to be done in a completely different way, where they couldn't assume that they always had the money to spend that they had previously had in their budget. She also said something that's really wise generally, I think, not just in this context of nonprofit crisis. But she said, "You do have to radically accept your reality. Assume that nothing is coming back, and nothing will be repaired. And then if something comes back, it's a cherry on top." Save the Children is a large organization. I want to be very clear about that. They have resources that most of us don't. But their principles for navigating this crisis can be scaled down to any organization. Accept the reality, over-communicate with stakeholders, plan, and move forward. That works everywhere. Now let me tell you about another kind of organization. Smaller, volunteer-run, with fewer resources, but fortunately with no less fight in them. In April 2025, a group of faith communities in Santa Fe, New Mexico, looked around the immigrant services in their community and saw an acute need. The U.S. Department of Justice had recently cut funding for immigrant legal services, and the organizations that offered those services were suddenly without resources. The U.S. justice system can be perplexing even to those of us who grew up in it. So, for those who didn't and who speak a different language, these organizations existed to help people navigate it. So in Santa Fe, when the federal funding was cut, a group of enterprising community members took up the mantle. With no full-time staff and with minimal infrastructure, they raised nearly $50,000 quickly to provide legal services, rent assistance, and other help to these communities. They also deployed volunteers to help immigrant community members when ICE activity made them feel unsafe. According to Nonprofit Quarterly, this small, plucky group of volunteers operated with, quote, just enough structure to do what it needs to. By the time this was reported by Nonprofit Quarterly, the organization was already looking at expanding to more areas of need. Two organizations, one with a century of history and a global footprint, one operating off of a borrowed folding table, probably. The only thing they had in common was finding a way to keep serving their communities through a financial crisis. The research on which organizations fared better in 2025 is consistent across multiple sources and points to some very interesting factors. Reserves mattered enormously. The Nonprofit Finance Fund's 2025 report showed that 52% of organizations had 3 months or less of cash on hand. Those organizations with 6 months or more had options, and those without it had an emergency. Revenue diversification mattered. Those organizations where government funding amounted to 50% or more of their total revenue were, of course, stuck here. And were those organizations that had multiple funding sources, individual giving, foundations, earned revenue, and contracts with various government agencies, were able to fare better. Scenario planning mattered. Those organizations who had previously asked themselves, what happens if our biggest funder disappears, had a plan that they could execute. Those who were asking themselves this question for the first time were forced to make consequential decisions under pressure without that framework. I want to say something about scenario planning because it doesn't need to be a scary big thing or an expensive consultant or piece of software or board retreat even. At a small nonprofit, scenario planning can be one person asking 3 questions. Number 1 is, if your biggest funder disappeared tomorrow, what would you protect first? Number 2 is, if you had to protect just your most important core missions, how much would that cost you? Then 3, with your available cash on hand or guaranteed funding, how long can your organization operate running just that core programming? Those 3 questions, answered honestly and written down, and then shared with the board and leadership team, that's a scenario plan, at least the beginnings of one. It takes an afternoon, sometimes even less. And during that 2025 financial crisis, it would have been worth more than any planning that anybody on any of those nonprofit boards could have done. The benchmarking report from the 2025 Nonprofit Standards Survey found that 80% of nonprofits reported being impacted negatively by federal funding policy changes. But it also found that 64% responded by building collaborative partnerships with similar organizations, sharing grant writing, infrastructure, operational resources, getting creative with more limited resources. And 88% reported plans to meaningfully expand their resources offered or shift their mission focus to better match the federal funding that's available. These are imperfect adaptations, but the sector is adapting. So what does this mean for your organization, practically, right now? First, know your exposure. What % of your total revenue comes from any single source? Government, foundation, individual, donor, doesn't matter which. If any single source represents more than 30 to 40% of your budget, you have meaningful concentration risk. Not a crisis, a risk worth managing deliberately. Second, say it with me, build the reserve. I have said this in almost every episode, and I will keep saying it. Your own money is the best defense against external forces. 3 months of operating expenses is the minimum target, 6 months is better. You build it through small, deliberate budget surpluses year after year. It is slow, it is unglamorous, and it requires trimming spending in several consecutive years. It is also the single most important thing you can do to safeguard your organization's financial health. Third is to run the scenario. Gather your ED, your treasurer, and your accountant and ask if our single biggest funder disappeared tomorrow, what core programs would we protect? You don't have to be in a crisis to do this. In fact, you're meant to do it beforehand so that if then a crisis arrives, you have a plan that you can execute. 4 is to communicate before you have to. One of the clearest messages from the Save the Children experience is that they communicated consistently with staff, funders, and other stakeholders, even before they had all the information that they felt was necessary to do so. They were uncertain, and they kept communication open. This built trust among all those different stakeholders, and it helped make recovery possible. And finally, the 5th is to adapt. Stay nimble. The Santa Fe Coalition did not wait for someone else to come along and solve the problem. They saw that there was a need, they pooled their resources and said, we can do something about this. It was imperfect, it wasn't as good as it was before maybe, but it was far, far better than nothing. If you want help understanding your organization's financial exposure, building a reserve policy, or helping craft multi-year budgets, you're going to need great bookkeeping. That is exactly why my firm, Tucker Business Services, offers full-service bookkeeping for nonprofits that is backed by years of experience. We offer bookkeeping, payroll, and executive financial coaching. We can be your partners in financial management. Our link is in the description. Yanti Saripto and her team, in January 2025, sat in a room together and watched 1/3 of their funding disappear in real time. They went through anger and bargaining and depression and all the rest. And then they got to work. A small coalition in Santa Fe looked at a gap in their community's needs and filled it with $50,000 and a lot of volunteer work. Both organizations saw a problem in their community and they filled it. Both stories are about organizations that responded to a financial crisis with clarity, honesty, and a willingness to adapt. That is what financial resilience looks like. The ability to take a shock and keep on going. Build your reserves. Run your scenarios, know your exposure, communicate early and often. And when the unexpected happens, and it will, you will be ready to get to work, and you'll make it through. Next episode, we're talking about grant tracking and reporting, the documents needed, the systems you'll want to have in place, how to do it right. And in a return to our usual format of saying, huh? At somebody making very questionable choices, we'll look at a Washington, D.C. nonprofit whose executive director allegedly made a transfer of $57,000 to her personal checking account. So that'll be fun. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Leave a like if you liked it. I'm Evan. This is the Nonprofit CFO. We'll see you in the next one.